Welcome to Weekly Neurology Deep Dive. We're going to be going over a recent study on a potential new treatment for ALS. It's called tetramethylpyrazine nitrone, or TBN for short. As always, this deep dive is for educational purposes only, and it doesn't replace reading the full research paper. Just think of this as your shortcut to understanding the most important takeaways for neurologists. Before we get started, a quick reminder. This podcast is for educational purposes only and doesn't have any commercial intent. This is just a summary. And you should always read the full paper for a comprehensive understanding. All right, so with that out of the way, let's dive into the study itself. It was a phase 2 multi-center randomized controlled trial conducted in China, and it was recently published in JAMA Network Open.
So this study looked at TBN. It's a compound that's actually derived from the Chinese herb chuangsheng. And preclinical studies have suggested it could potentially be really helpful in managing ALS. And so this particular trial was designed to see, okay, how effective and how safe is this in humans?
And this is particularly relevant because, the current FDA-approved treatments for ALS, riluzole and edaravone, they only offer limited benefits. Riluzole, for example, it may extend survival, but it doesn't actually improve symptoms. And edaravone, well, its effectiveness has been a bit inconsistent. So could TBN offer a new path forward for these patients?
That's exactly the question the researchers were trying to figure out. And one of the things that makes TBN so interesting is its multifaceted approach to how it actually combats ALS. It works on a lot of different levels. It reduces oxidative stress, it helps improve mitochondrial function, and it even helps to clear out, those harmful protein aggregates that we know build up in the brains of people with ALS. And what's really important is that TBN can effectively cross the blood-brain barrier, which is absolutely critical for any drug that's trying to target the central nervous system.
So in this study, they included 155 ALS patients, and they were randomly assigned to receive either a low dose of TBN, a high dose, or a placebo. And this went on for 180 days. The researchers were primarily interested in seeing how the ALS-FRSR score changed, which is a standard way to measure functional ability in ALS patients.
And this is where the results get really interesting. While there wasn't a statistically significant difference between the TBN groups and the placebo group, when it came to the overall ALS-FRSR score, the high-dose TBN group showed something pretty remarkable.
Yeah, the high-dose TBN. It significantly slowed the decline in grip strength, which, as you know, is a really key marker of disease progression in ALS. Can you talk a little bit about why this specific finding is so noteworthy?
Absolutely. This is really significant because none of the current FDA-approved treatments have shown any real substantial impact on grip strength. So even though it's just one specific area, this positive result really suggests that TBN might be actually having a real effect on slowing down the progression of the disease itself.
Now, the study also revealed that this effect on grip strength was even more pronounced in a specific subgroup of patients. This is really important, I think, for neurologists. Can you tell us more about this subgroup and why the response to TBN was different?
Yeah, so this subgroup, it included patients who were under 65 years old and who were also experiencing slower disease progression. And in this group, the high-dose TBN showed a mean difference of 3.63 kilograms in grip strength decline compared to the placebo. So that's a pretty clinically significant difference. And it raises a really important question. Could TBN actually be more effective when it's given earlier in the disease course? Now, that's something that future research is going to have to really dig into. But these initial findings definitely suggest that TBN's effectiveness, it might be tied to both age and the rate of disease progression.
Before we go any further, let's step back for a second and talk about who was included in the study to begin with. What were the specific inclusion criteria?
Okay, so to be eligible for the study, patients had to be between 45 and 70 years old, and they had to have had ALS onset within the past 2 years. Their ALS-FRS score had to be at least 2 points on each item, which basically indicates a reasonable level of function across the board. They also needed to have a forced vital capacity, or FVC, of at least 80%, meaning their breathing muscles were still relatively strong. And lastly, participants had to have experienced a decline in their ALS-FRSR score of 1 to 4 points during a 3-month screening period. And this was to make sure that they were studying individuals with active disease progression.
So it sounds like they were trying to enroll a fairly homogeneous group of patients at a similar stage of ALS.
Exactly. And that's important to keep in mind when we're interpreting the results. What we're seeing with TBN might not necessarily apply to all ALS patients, especially those who are further along in the disease.
So the inclusion criteria are quite specific. The low-dose TBN group received 600 milligrams twice daily, and the high-dose group received 1,200 milligrams twice daily. Now on to the critical question of safety. What kinds of side effects did the patients experience?
Well, the study actually found that TBN was generally well tolerated. There were no serious treatment-related adverse events reported.
That's good to hear. What were some of the specific adverse events they saw, even if they weren't considered serious?
Well, the most common adverse events they saw across all the groups, even the placebo group, were things like COVID-19, urinary tract infections, and upper respiratory tract infections. Some patients also had elevated liver enzymes, but these were generally transient and not really considered a big deal.
Okay, so nothing that would raise any major red flags from a safety perspective. But as with any study, there's always limitations. What are some of the key limitations that we should be aware of when we're interpreting these findings?
I think one of the main limitations is the duration of the study. 180 days is kind of a short period of time for a disease like ALS, which can progress over years. So while we see some promising signs with TBN, we don't really know if those benefits are going to last long term. The study also didn't look at long-term survival. They looked at the time to endpoint events like death, tracheostomy, or needing ventilation. But actual survival rates weren't specifically analyzed.
Right, that makes sense given the limited study duration.
Yeah.
Did they track any biomarkers beyond the ALS, FRSR, and grip strength?
Well, another limitation is that they didn't measure neurofilament light chain levels. These proteins are released when nerve cells get damaged, and you can actually measure them in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. So looking at those levels could have given us a better understanding of whether TBN was actually slowing down the underlying neurodegeneration.
That would have been valuable information to have.
Right.
While there's still a lot of unanswered questions, these findings are still pretty exciting. What would you say makes this research so compelling for neurologists in particular?
Well, I think the improvement in grip strength, especially in that younger subgroup, is really interesting, and I think it warrants further investigation, especially in larger, longer-term trials. It really begs the question, could TBN be even more effective if it started earlier in the disease course? The subgroup findings definitely hint at that possibility, and it's something researchers should really explore further.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and focus on what these findings mean for neurologists, in their day-to-day practice. What are some of the key practical takeaways here?
I think the most important takeaway is that while TBN didn't show a big impact on overall functional scores for everyone in the study, the improvement in grip strength, especially in that subgroup of patients under 65 with slower disease progression, is something to really pay attention to. They actually saw improvements not just in grip strength, but also in bulbar and respiratory function. And this raises a really crucial question. Could TBN be more effective if it's given earlier in the disease?
So how should neurologists apply this knowledge when they're seeing patients? Is it too early to think about using TBN in clinical practice?
We always have to be careful about taking the results from a single study, especially a phase 2 trial, and applying it directly to real-world clinical practice. Remember, this study was done in China, and that patient population might not be exactly the same as ALS patients in other parts of the world. We definitely need larger, longer-term studies to confirm these findings and figure out the best dose and who would benefit most from TBN. It would also be good to see studies that specifically look at neurofilament light chain levels to really understand how TBN affects the neurodegenerative process. But in the meantime, I think neurologists should be aware of these findings and consider talking about them with their ALS patients, especially those who fit the profile of that younger, slower progressing subgroup.
Right, and it's important to emphasize that TBN is not FDA approved for ALS. This is just one study, and we need a lot more data before we can make any definitive recommendations.
Absolutely. Neurologists need to stay up to date on the latest research, but also use their clinical judgment and tailor treatment recommendations to each individual patient's needs.
So how would you advise neurologists to approach this new information when they're having discussions with their patients?
I think transparency is key. Explain to patients that while these results are promising, they're still preliminary. We need more research to know for sure. If TBN is truly effective and safe for long-term use, emphasize that this study showed improvement in grip strength, but not in other measures of ALS progression. And also explain that the benefits were most obvious in patients who were younger and had slower disease progression.
Though managing expectations is really important. It's not a cure, and it might not work for everyone.
Exactly. And we have to be honest about the study's limitations. It was a relatively small trial, and the follow-up period was short. But, it does offer a glimmer of hope for ALS patients and their families. I'd love to see research explore whether TBN might be helpful in combination with other ALS treatments. And there's also the question of whether starting TBN earlier, even before symptoms appear, might lead to better outcomes.
Early intervention is so crucial. In
Yeah.
so many neurological diseases, it would be really amazing to see if that holds true for TBN and ALS. We also need more research to figure out the best dose of TBN
Hmm.
and what its long-term safety profile looks like. What are some of the key questions that neurologists should be asking themselves as they're thinking about this study?
I think some important questions are, do you have patients who might be good candidates for TBN? Considering their age and how quickly their disease is progressing, how would you talk about these findings with your patients in a way that's balanced and informative? And what are your thoughts on TBN's potential within the current landscape of ALS treatments?
Those are all excellent points for neurologists to consider. Let's dive a little deeper into the safety data. As we wrap up this deep dive, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into tetramethylpyrazine nitrone, or TBN, as a potential new treatment for ALS. We've talked about the main findings and what they mean for neurologists, but let's really focus on the safety data now.
Yeah, safety is a huge concern, obviously, especially with a disease as serious as ALS. And what's really encouraging from this study is that TBN seemed to be pretty well tolerated overall.
Can you remind us about the types of adverse events they saw?
Sure. So, as we mentioned earlier, the most common adverse events were things like COVID-19 urinary tract infections and those upper respiratory tract infections. And we saw those across all the groups, including the placebo group.
Okay, so those were pretty common, but were there any adverse events that seemed to be directly related to TBN?
There were a few cases of elevated liver enzymes, but those were usually temporary and not considered serious. And importantly, there weren't any deaths or serious adverse events that were thought to be caused by the TBN.
That is reassuring, especially when you think about some of the side effects we see with other ALS treatments. Did the study give us any information about the long-term effects of TBN on organs like the liver and kidneys?
Unfortunately, this study didn't specifically look at long-term organ effects. It's something we definitely need to keep in mind going forward, especially because they excluded patients who already had serious liver or kidney problems from the study.
So we need more data before we can say for sure that TBN is safe to use long-term. So where does this leave neurologists who are treating ALS patients every day?
Well, I think this study definitely gives us a little bit of hope, but we can't get too carried away with the results of just one phase 2 trial.
What would you say is the most important takeaway for neurologists?
I think the main takeaway is that TBN shows some real promise, but we need a lot more research to confirm these initial findings. It's important to talk to your ALS patients about these results, but be sure to manage their expectations. You know, TBN isn't FDA approved yet, and we don't know what the long-term effects might be.
Neurologists are going to need to weigh the potential benefits of TBN against what we don't know yet. It seems like the decision of whether or not to even try TBN as a treatment option is something that should be decided on a case-by-case basis, in consultation with the patient and their family.
I agree completely. And we have to remember, this is a field that's constantly changing. There's always new research coming out. So it's crucial for neurologists to stay up to date on the latest findings so they can provide the best possible care for their patients.
That's great advice. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into TBN and its potential role in treating ALS. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.